The sky above Elithera 9 turned the color of blood and ash as the first Vreth warships broke through the orbital defense grid like knives through wet paper. Commander Lena Vasic stood on the bridge of the last planetary defense station and watched her world die in real time on 100 different screens, each one showing a different city burning, a different shield failing, a different column of refugees being cut off from the evacuation points that had already been overrun. She had known this day was coming for years. Everyone had known. Humanity had spread too far, too fast, and too fearlessly across 3 galactic arms, and the elder species of the Galactic Accord had watched with growing unease as these small, soft, short-lived creatures built colonies on worlds that had been considered uninhabitable. Cracked problems that had stumped civilizations 10,000 years older, and bred with a speed that made the ancient races nervous in a way they had not felt. Since the last great extinction war, the Vreth Dominion had been the first to say what others were thinking, that humanity was a plague species, a weed that would choke the garden of the galaxy if it was not pulled out by the roots. And so they had come with their fleets and their singularity bombs and their cold mathematical certainty that the galaxy would be better off without humans in it. The war had lasted 11 years. Humanity had fought with everything it had, every ship, every station, every improvised weapon and desperate strategy that the most creative and stubborn species in the galaxy could devise, and it had not been enough. One by one, the colony worlds had gone dark. Earth itself had fallen 3 years ago, its oceans boiled away by orbital bombardment, its mountains turned to glass, its 6 billion remaining inhabitants reduced to ash and memory. Now there was only Elithera 9, the last major colony, and it was dying too. Gripped the edge of the command console and made one final broadcast on every allied frequency she could reach, her voice steady, even as the ceiling above her cracked and rained dust. This is Commander Lena Vasic of the Elithera Defense Force, broadcasting to any allied species still receiving on this channel. We are requesting immediate military assistance. Our shields are down, and the Vreth are entering the atmosphere. If anyone can hear this, we need help now. Silence answered her. The Karathi had surrendered 6 months ago, and handed over their fleet to the Vreth as a peace offering. The Melisari had declared neutrality and sealed their borders. The Thin Council had simply stopped responding to human communications, as if pretending that humanity had already ceased to exist would make it true. No one was coming. Lena closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds, and then she opened them and started giving orders, because that was what humans did. They kept moving, they kept fighting, they kept trying to save whoever could still be saved, even when the math said it was impossible. 3 kilometers away from the defense station, in the basement level of the new Thessaly Central Medical Center, a maternity ward was still operational, despite the fact that the upper floors had already been hit twice by Vreth precision strikes. A nurse named Dara Osei was working by emergency lighting, moving from bed to bed, checking on the mothers and newborns who had nowhere else to go because the evacuation transports were full and the streets above were on fire. There were 9 babies in the ward. Dara knew she could not save all of them. The building shook again and a wall collapsed in the corridor outside, sealing the main exit with tons of broken concrete and twisted steel. Dara did not scream, and she did not freeze. She picked up the nearest infant, a boy born less than 6 hours ago, and she carried him to the emergency life pod station at the far end of the ward. Every medical facility on human worlds had these pods, small armored capsules designed to launch a single patient into orbit during catastrophic events. And Dara had always thought they were a foolish optimism, a gesture toward hope in situations where hope had no business being. She placed the baby inside the pod and strapped him in with hands that were shaking but sure. The baby's name was stitched into his thermal blanket in neat blue letters, Kale Vasic. and his mother was the woman currently dying 3 kilometers away, trying to buy time for ships that would never launch. Dara did not know this. She only knew that the baby was small and warm and alive, and that the pod had enough power to reach orbit if she launched it in the next 90 seconds. She sealed the pod and pressed the launch command, and watched the tiny capsule shoot upward through the emergency shaft and disappear into the smoke-filled sky above the city. Then the ceiling came down, and Dara Osei was gone. Across the city, Lena Vasic received a single automated ping on her personal channel, the LifePod's transponder signal, telling her that her son was alive and rising through the atmosphere. She had 3 minutes left. She used one of them to send a message to the pod's navigation system, a set of coordinates that pointed to a place no human had ever been welcome, a place that most species considered a death sentence to approach, a vast and radiation-choked nebula on the far edge of the galaxy, where ancient and terrible things were said to sleep. The Dragon Nebula. Lena did not know if the stories were true, stories of beings older than most stars, creatures of living metal and cosmic fire who had withdrawn from the galaxy millions of years ago because they found younger species exhausting and pointless. But she knew that the Vreth would not follow her son there. No one went into the Dragon Nebula. She used her last 2 minutes to hold the spaceport gate with a squad of 14 volunteers, so that 3 civilian transports, carrying 6,000 people, could clear the atmosphere. She died standing up with a rifle in her hands, and her eyes on the sky where her son had disappeared. The Vreth Dominion declared victory before the fires on Elethera 9 had even finished burning. Humanity was functionally extinct, scattered remnants hiding in asteroid belts and the cargo holds of stolen ships. No homeworld, no fleet, no government, no future. The galaxy moved on, but deep in the Dragon Nebula, where dying stars painted the darkness in shades of red and gold, something ancient stirred. Sensors older than most civilizations detected a tiny object drifting through the outer clouds. A life pod, battered and scorched, its power fading, its single passenger crying in the way that all newborns cry, without understanding, without fear, simply announcing to the universe that they existed, and they were hungry, and they wanted someone to hold them. A shape moved in the dark, vast beyond comprehension, a mountain of golden scales and folded wings that caught the light of collapsing stars and reflected it back like a second sunrise. A single eye opened, golden, ancient, and impossibly deep, and focused on the tiny pod tumbling through the fire-laced clouds. Something that had not felt curiosity in 10 million years felt it now. Vale Tharian had been alive for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be surprised. He was a Drathian, one of the eldest of his kind, a creature of living metal and stellar fire, whose body stretched 12 kilometers from the tip of his armored snout to the end of his crystalline tail, whose wings could cast shadows over entire cities, whose voice could shake apart the molecular bonds of stone and steel if he spoke too loudly. He had been born in a time when the galaxy was young and wild and full of things that had no names yet. He had watched the first civilizations rise from the mud of their homeworlds and reach for the stars with clumsy hands and burning hearts. He had watched them build empires and then tear those empires down and then build new ones on the ruins and call it progress. He had watched them go to war over territory and resources and ideology and pride and boredom and fear, and he had watched them die in numbers so large, the counting of them became meaningless. After a few million years of this, the Drathan had simply stopped caring. They withdraw into the Dragon Nebula, a vast cloud of radiation and dying stars that no sane species would enter, and they slept and they dreamed, and they told each other that the galaxy could burn itself to ash, and it would not matter, because the small ones always burned themselves, and there was no point in trying to stop them. Veltharion believed this with absolute certainty. He had believed it for so long that it had become less a belief and more a part of his body, as natural and unquestioned as the fire that ran through his veins. And then he found the pod. It was caught in the gravitational pull of a collapsing star, spinning slowly through the hot clouds of the outer nebula, and it was so small that at first he thought it was debris, a fragment of some ship that had wandered too close to the nebula and been torn apart by the radiation storms. But his ancient sensors told him otherwise. There was life inside, a single heartbeat, fast and fragile, the rhythm of something very small and very new. He almost turned away. The doctrine of the Drathan was clear, and it had served them well for millions of years. Do not interfere, do not engage, do not attach yourself to things that will die before you finish your next thought, because the grief of such attachment is a wound that never heals. He almost turned away, but he did not. Instead, he reached out with a field of controlled gravity and pulled the pod gently toward him, cradling it in the space between his massive forelimbs, the way a human might cup a firefly in their palms. He scanned it. Inside was a human infant, wrapped in a thermal blanket, with a name stitched into the fabric in blue thread, Kale. The baby was 6 hours old, and he was hungry and cold and alone in the dark, and he was going to die within the next 20 minutes as the pod's life support systems failed one by one. Valetharian should have let it happen. It would have been a mercy, a quick end to a small life that had no future in a galaxy that had already decided his species did not deserve to exist. But the pod's memory core held a message, and Valetharian played it because curiosity was the one weakness he had never been able to burn out of himself, no matter how many millions of years he tried. A woman's voice filled the space around him, tired, broken, steady in the way that things are steady when they have already accepted the worst and moved past it into a calm place beyond fear. I am not asking you to fight for us. I know what you are, and I know that you do not fight for anyone. I am not asking you to save humanity, or avenge us, or take our side in a war that is already lost. I am asking you to let him live. Just him, just this one small life. He did not choose to be born into a dying species, and he does not deserve to die for the sins of his people. Please, if there is anything left in you that remembers what it feels like to protect something smaller than yourself, please let my son live. The message ended. Valetharian floated in the dark with the pod resting against his chest, and the echoes of a dead woman's voice fading into the radiation hiss of the nebula, and he felt something crack open inside him. Something old and heavy that he had sealed shut so long ago that he had forgotten it was there. He remembered. He remembered a time before the withdrawal, before the doctrine, before the long sleep, a time when a Drathan mother had positioned herself between her 3 hatchlings and an exploding star, and had held her wings closed around them for 11 days, while the fire burned through her scales and her flesh and her bones, until the storm passed and her children emerged alive into a universe that still had her warmth in it, even though she was gone. The instinct to protect something smaller than yourself was not a weakness. It was the oldest thing the Drathan had, older than their fire, older than their scales, older than their pride. Valetharian opened the pod with a precision that should have been impossible for a creature his size, using microfields of gravitational force so delicate that they could peel the shell of an egg without cracking it. And he lifted the baby out into the warm space between his forelimbs, where the heat of his body created a pocket of breathable air. The baby stopped crying. He looked up at the golden eye that was larger than his entire body, and he did not scream or flinch or show any fear at all, because he was 6 hours old, and he did not know that he was supposed to be afraid of something this vast and ancient and powerful. He just looked up and blinked, and made a small sound that meant nothing and everything. Valetharian brought the child to his nesting grounds, a hollow planetoid deep in the nebulous core, lined with crystallized starfire that gave off a soft golden light. And the moment he arrived, the other Draythan knew what he had done. Sirathine came first, the eldest of them all, nearly twice Valtharian's size, her scales the deep blue-black of a sky between stars, and she looked at the tiny creature cradled in his gravitational field, with an expression that mixed disbelief and disgust and something that might have been pity. "You bring a mayfly into our home," she said, and her voice was the sound of glaciers grinding against each other in the dark. "He has a name," Valtharian said. "They all have names. They name themselves, and they name their children, and they name their ships, and their cities, and their wars, and then they die, and the names mean nothing. This is what the small ones do, and this is why we left them to their burning." "His mother asked me to protect him," Valtharian said. "And you," Sirathine said, "will, for what? 60 years, 80, a single breath of your life spent nursing a creature that will grow old and die while you are still remembering his first cry. This is not protection, Valtharian, this is self-harm." The other Draythan gathered in the vast cavern of the planetoid, their enormous bodies filling the space with heat and light, and they watched Valtharian with eyes that had seen the birth and death of stars, and they waited for him to see reason. He did not see reason. He folded his wings, each one large enough to shade a city, around the tiny warm bundle in his gravitational cradle, and he looked at Sirathine and at all of them, and he spoke a single word in the oldest Draythan tongue, a word that had not been spoken in 10 million years, because it belonged to a time before the withdrawal, before the doctrine, before the long and comfortable numbness. "Mine." The word rang through the planetoid like a bell, and the crystallized starfire in the walls hummed with it, and the other Draythan fell silent, because that word was sacred, and it was binding, and it meant that Vaeltheron had claimed this creature as his ward, his charge, his responsibility, and no force in the galaxy, not the Vreth Dominion, not the Galactic Accord, not even the other Draythan, could take the child from him without going through 12 kilometers of living metal and stellar fire. In the cold space beyond the nebula, the Vreth Dominion's intelligence network detected an anomaly, an energy signature from the Dragon Nebula that had not been observed in recorded history. Something had changed. A Draythan had bonded with an outsider for the first time in millions of years. The Vreth High Command studied the data and felt something they had not felt since the beginning of the Annihilation War: uncertainty. They dispatched a diplomatic envoy to the nebulous edge, carrying a formal demand for the surrender of the human child. Behind the envoy, hidden in the shadow of a gas giant, they positioned a war fleet of 200 ships. 18 years passed inside the Dragon Nebula, and in that time Valtharian learned that raising a human child was the most difficult thing he had ever attempted in his entire existence. And he had once held a dying star together with his bare claws for 600 years while a civilization evacuated a solar system. The problem was scale. Valtharian was 12 kilometers long, and the baby was less than half a meter. And everything about human children was so impossibly fragile and demanding and specific that it made the physics of collapsing neutron stars seem simple by comparison. The child needed food, not starfire, not radiation, not the crystallized energy that sustained a Draythan, but actual organic nutrition synthesized from carbon and hydrogen and oxygen, in combinations so precise that getting even one molecule wrong could poison him. The child needed warmth, but not too much warmth, because the heat that radiated from Valtharian's body could melt steel at close range, and the difference between comfortable and fatal for a human infant was a matter of a few degrees. The child needed to be held. This was the part that nearly broke Valtharian, because his smallest claw was larger than the child's entire body, and the gravitational microfields he used to cradle the baby were designed for manipulating asteroids, not handling something that weighed less than 4 kilograms, and bruised if you looked at it wrong. But Valtharion was old and patient, and he had survived things that would have destroyed lesser beings, and he refused to fail at this. He shed scales from his own body, each one harder than any material the younger species had ever manufactured, and he used the heat of his own fire to forge them into micro-drones, tiny machines no larger than a human hand, each one controlled by a fragment of his consciousness, and capable of the delicate, precise work that his massive body could not perform. Built a habitat inside the hollow planetoid, a small pressurized space with artificial gravity and filtered air and temperature controls, and everything a growing human child would need to survive. They synthesized food from the raw materials of the nebula. Not delicious food. Valtharion had no concept of taste, but nutritionally complete food that kept the child alive and growing, even if it had the texture and flavor of warm cardboard. They built teaching systems, using data from the pod's memory core, and from the transmissions that leaked into the nebula from the outside galaxy. Language programs, and history archives, and science databases that the drones assembled into something resembling an education. And Valtharion himself did the one thing that no machine or drone could do. He talked to the boy. Every day he positioned himself outside the habitat, his enormous golden eye filling the window like a second sun, and he told Kale stories about the birth of galaxies and the death of stars, and the time he had raced a beam of light across the Andromeda Gap just to see if he could, and he had lost, but only barely. He told him about the species he had watched rise and fall over millions of years, the brilliant ones and the foolish ones, and the ones that were both at the same time, which was most of them. He told him about humanity, what he knew of them, which was less than he expected, because he had never paid much attention to them before. A young species, restless and loud, and strangely compelling in the way they threw themselves at problems that should have been impossible, and sometimes solved them through sheer refusal to accept that they could not be solved. Kale grew. He went from a crying infant, to a crawling baby, to a walking toddler, to a curious child, to a restless teenager, and every stage brought new challenges that Valtharion met with the same patient determination that he brought to everything. When Kale was 7 and asked why he had no mother, Valtharion told him the truth, simply and without softening it, because the Drathan did not believe in comfortable lies, and the boy had cried, and Valtharion had wrapped a gravitational field around him so gently that it felt like an embrace, and he had held the boy in that invisible warmth until the crying stopped. When Kale was 12 and tried to climb the inner wall of the planetoid to prove he could, and fell 30 meters and broke his arm, Valtharion's drone set the bone, and the dragon did not sleep for 4 days, because he was recalculating every safety measure in the habitat, and adding new ones, and cursing the absurd fragility of human skeletal structure. When Kale was 15, and angry at everything, angry at the nebula for being a cage, angry at the galaxy for killing his people, angry at Valtharion for keeping him hidden, the dragon simply let him rage because he had seen enough angry young creatures in his time to know that this fire needed to burn itself out, not be smothered. By the time Kale was 18, he was something the galaxy had never seen before. He was human, fully and completely human in all the ways that mattered. Restless and curious and empathetic and impatient and burning with a need to move and build and connect and change things. But he had been educated by a being that thought in timescales of millions of years and understood the architecture of stars the way a human understood the layout of their own home. He spoke 3 Drathan harmonic languages, deep subsonic vibrations that he produced using a device he had built himself, because human vocal cords could not make sounds that low. He understood stellar mechanics and gravitational engineering and energy manipulation at a level that no human scientist had ever reached, because no human scientist had ever had a 12-kilometer-long living textbook who could. Demonstrate the principles by casually reshaping an asteroid with one claw. He was extraordinary, and he was completely alone. He found his mother's message on a quiet evening when he was sorting through the pod's memory core for the 100th time, looking for anything he might have missed. He had always known the message existed. Valtharion had told him about it years ago, but he had never been able to bring himself to listen to it. Now he did. He heard his mother's voice, tired and broken and steady, asking a dragon to let her son live. And then he accessed the pod's historical database, and he learned the full scope of what had happened to his species. The Annihilation War, the fall of Earth, the burning of Elithera 9, the scattering of humanity's survivors into the dark spaces between stars, where they hid like hunted animals in hollowed-out asteroids and the cargo holds of stolen ships. 200 million humans left alive in a galaxy of trillions. No homeworld, no fleet, no government, no future. Kale walked out of the habitat and stood on the surface of the hollow planetoid and looked up at Valtharion's enormous form, coiled around the cavern ceiling like a mountain range made of gold, and he asked the question that changed everything. You saved me. Why will you not save them? Valtharion's answer came slowly, each word heavy with a grief so old it had fossilized into something that looked like wisdom. Because every time we intervened, we became the thing we sought to prevent. Power like mine does not liberate, Kale. It replaces one master with another. I will not become what I despise. Then do not fight for them, Kale said, and his voice was calm in a way that reminded Valtharion painfully of the boy's mother. Teach me to fight for them. Give me the knowledge, not the power. Give me the tools, not the throne. Valtharion looked at the small figure standing below him. This tiny creature he had raised from a helpless infant. This impossible human who spoke the language of dragons and thought in the mathematics of stars, and still, after everything, wanted nothing more than to help other people. No species had ever asked him for knowledge instead of power. No species had ever wanted to learn instead of to conquer. He felt the crack inside him widen, the one that had opened 18 years ago when he heard a dead woman's voice asking him to save her son. And through that crack poured something warm and terrifying and alive. I will teach you, he said. At the edge of the nebula, the Vreth diplomatic envoy delivered its demand. Surrender the human child or face consequences. Valtharion flew to the border of his domain, 12 kilometers of golden scales and burning wings, moving through the nebula clouds like a warship made of sunlight. And he faced the Vreth fleet alone. He did not attack. Threaten. He simply existed there, immovable and vast and ancient beyond calculation. And he spoke in a voice that the Vreth ships felt in their hulls. The child is under my wing. You may test that if you wish. The Vreth fleet withdrew, but their admiral sent a cold message back to High Command. 3 words that would set the next phase of the war in motion. The dragon cares. This is a weakness we can use. Kale left the Dragon Nebula on a morning that had no sunrise, because mornings inside a nebula are measured not by light, but by the rhythm of a dragon's breathing. The slow, deep inhalation that made the walls of the planetoid hum, and the long, warm exhalation that sent currents of golden light rippling through the crystallized starfire. His ship was small, barely 40 meters long, but it was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen, because it was built from Draythan-scale alloy, forged in the heat of Valtharion's own fire, and shaped by gravitational fields that no younger species knew how to generate. It could withstand forces that would crush a Vreth battlecruiser like a tin can, and it moved through space with an efficiency that violated several assumptions the galactic scientific community had held as absolute truth for thousands of years. But it carried no weapons. Kale had insisted on this, and Valtharion had agreed, because the whole point was to prove that there was a way forward that did not require becoming the thing you were fighting against. The moment of departure was quiet. Valtharion coiled around the planetoid's interior and watched the small ship rise through the cavern's opening with an eye that had seen the births of 1 billion stars, but had never watched anything leave that he wanted so badly to keep. The other Draythan observed from their own perches in the nebula's depths, massive shapes of blue and silver and deep red, and they said nothing, because even Cyrathene, who had warned Valtharion that this would end in grief, could see that the grief had already begun, and that speaking would not make it smaller. Kale set course for the galactic fringe, where his mother's pod had contained fragmented data about possible human survivor locations, asteroid belts, and deep space dead zones, and the orbital shadows of gas giants, where a small ship could hide from Vreth patrol fleets. Worse than he had imagined. Humanity's remnants, numbered roughly 200 million souls, scattered across perhaps 1,000 hidden settlements. And the word settlements was generous for what most of them actually were: hollowed-out rocks with patched atmosphere systems, converted cargo ships with recycled air that tasted like metal and old sweat, abandoned mining stations on frozen moons where families huddled around failing heating units and told their children stories about a planet called Earth that most of them had never seen. They were broken, not just physically but spiritually, fractured into dozens of feuding factions that argued over resources and leadership and blame and the thousand small cruelties that desperate people inflict on each other when they have lost everything larger than themselves to hold on to. When Kale arrived at the first major refugee station, a converted fuel depot called Haven Point that housed roughly 30,000 people, in conditions that would have made a prison look comfortable, no one believed he was real. A human raised by dragons, a boy from the nebula. It sounded like a fairy tale, and fairy tales were a luxury that people on the edge of extinction could not afford. A faction leader named Torres, a hard woman with burn scars on her face, and the tired eyes of someone who had been fighting since before Kale was born, confronted him directly in the station's crowded central hall. "You walk in here with your fancy ship and your dragon stories, and you expect us to follow you. Where? To do what? We have been hiding for 18 years because the alternative is dying, and you want us to come out of hiding and make ourselves targets again." Kale looked at her, and at the crowd of thin, wary faces behind her, and he felt the weight of their exhaustion like a physical force pressing against his chest. "I am not asking you to follow me," he said, and he meant it. "Am not a leader, and I am not a general, and I do not have a plan to defeat the Vreth, because I do not think the Vreth can be defeated by force. Not by us, not with what we have." "Then what are you offering?" "Knowledge." He opened his ship's databanks, and he shared what Valtharon had taught him. Not weapons technology, not military strategy, but something far more valuable and far more dangerous. He shared Draythan engineering principles, methods of manipulating energy and matter that the elder species of the galaxy had never discovered, because they had never thought to look for them in the places where the Draythan looked. He shared stellar cartography so detailed and so vast that it mapped gravitational currents and energy flows that the galactic community did not even know existed. Hidden pathways through space that could move a ship from one side of the galaxy to the other in a fraction of the time conventional drives required. Philosophy that was not his own, but that he had made his own. The words of a being who had watched 1,000 civilizations rise and fall, and who had concluded that the only ones worth remembering were the ones that endured without becoming monsters. Endure, adapt, do not become the thing that tried to destroy you. Torres looked at the data, and then she looked at Kale, and then she looked at her people, and something shifted in her expression. Not hope exactly, because hope was too bright and too fragile a word for what moved through that crowded hall, but something like the memory of hope, the knowledge that it had existed once, and could perhaps exist again. They began to build. Not a war fleet. They did not have the resources for that. But something new, something the galaxy had never seen from humans before. A network, Using Kale's knowledge, they constructed communication systems that the Vreth could not detect, and transportation corridors that the Vreth did not know existed, and shielding technology that let their hidden stations disappear from sensors entirely. They reached out, not to other humans, but to other species, the small ones, the forgotten ones, the dozens of civilizations that the Vreth Dominion had conquered or marginalized or simply ignored, because they were not powerful enough to matter. The Pelori, whose homeworld had been strip-mined by the Vreth, and who lived now as refugees in their own system. The Keth Collective, a hive species that the Dominion had banned from reproducing beyond a quota set by Vreth population engineers. The Singing Monks of Vahari, a peaceful species whose cultural archives the Vreth had destroyed because they contained ideas about individual freedom that the Dominion considered dangerous. Kale went to each of them, not with promises of victory or threats of punishment, but with a simple offer. Help each other, share resources, share knowledge, build something together that is not an empire, because empires are what got us all into this situation. The galaxy had never seen a human do this. Humans had always been the aggressors, the restless, expanding, colonizing species that took what it wanted and apologized later if at all. Kale was something different, and the smaller species could feel it. A human who listened more than he spoke, who asked what they needed before telling them what he wanted, who treated civilizations that the Vreth considered insignificant as if they were the most important beings in the galaxy, because to Kale, they were. Vaeltharion had taught him many things, but the most important lesson was the simplest one, that the value of a life does not depend on its size or its power or its lifespan, but on the simple fact that it exists, and that it is trying its best to keep existing. The coalition grew slowly and quietly, like a vine growing through cracks in a stone wall. Vreth noticed. They responded the way empires always respond to things they do not understand, with violence. A Vreth strike force attacked a refugee station called Meridian's Rest, home to 40,000 humans and 12,000 Pelori, who had been sharing resources and building a joint agricultural system that was feeding both populations for the first time in years. The attack was fast and brutal and deliberate. The Vreth killed 8,000 people and broadcast the footage across the galaxy with a simple message. There is no coalition. There is only the Dominion. Kale watched the footage in the command center of Haven Point, and his hands shook, and his jaw tightened, and for one terrible moment, he wanted what every human who had ever been hurt wanted: revenge, retribution, the satisfaction of watching the people who had caused this suffering experience suffering of their own. But he heard Vaeltharion's voice in his mind, old and heavy and sad. Do not become the thing that tried to destroy you. He did not retaliate with weapons. Instead, he took the unedited footage, every frame of it, including the parts the Vreth had cut out, the parts that showed unarmed civilians being gunned down, and children running through burning corridors, and a Pelori elder shielding a human toddler with her own body, and he broadcast it to every species in the galaxy, alongside a single message in every language he could translate it into. This is what Empire looks like. We are offering something else. Within 6 weeks, 38 additional species made secret contact with the Coalition. Within 3 months, the number was 42. The Vreth High Command looked at the intelligence reports, and for the first time since the Annihilation War, they felt something cold and unfamiliar settling into the spaces behind their confident certainty. They were losing control. Not of territory and not of military advantage, but of something more important. They were losing the story, the narrative that said the Dominion existed because the galaxy needed order, and only the Vreth could provide it. A human raised by dragons was telling a different story, and the galaxy was listening. Grand Arbiter Ven, the highest military authority in the Dominion, made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. We will strike the Dragon Nebula itself. We will break the dragon, and we will break the myth, and we will show the galaxy that nothing is beyond our reach. Operation Silence was approved. 1,000 warships began their long journey toward the nebula, where an ancient creature of fire and gold waited in the dark, unaware that the galaxy he had turned his back on millions of years ago was coming to test the only thing he had left that mattered. Veiltharion felt the fleet before his sensors detected it. A tremor in the fabric of space, a wrongness in the gravitational currents of the nebula, like the feeling a spider gets when something too heavy and too deliberate touches the edge of its web. 1,000 Vreth warships, each one a kilometer long, bristling with weapons designed to crack moons and sterilize worlds. Crewed by soldiers who had been told that this mission would be the final proof of the Dominion's absolute supremacy over every living thing in the galaxy. Grand Arbiter Ven commanded the fleet from the bridge of the Absolute Mandate, the largest warship ever constructed by any species, and he was calm in the way that only someone who has never truly been challenged can be calm. The Draythan were ancient, yes, powerful, yes, but they were few, and they were pacifists, and they had not fought a war in millions of years. This would not be a battle, Ven told himself. A demonstration. He was wrong about everything except the number of dragons who would fight. Veiltharion met the fleet alone at the outer boundary of the nebula. The other Draythan had withdrawn deeper into the nebula's core, true to their doctrine of non-interference, true to the philosophy that had kept them safe and numb and useless for 10 million years. Sirathine had looked at Veiltharion before she left, and her ancient blue-black eyes held something complicated. Not approval, not condemnation, but a kind of sorrow that comes from watching someone you respect walk toward something you believe will destroy them. "You do not have to do this," she said. "Yes, I do," Veiltharion answered, and his voice was the quietest she had ever heard it. Not the rumble of a dragon preparing for war, but the steady calm of a father who hears something dangerous moving toward his child's room in the dark. He flew to meet the fleet, and he was magnificent. 12 kilometers of golden scales blazing with internal fire, wings spread wide enough to eclipse a small moon, eyes burning with a light that had been lit before most of the stars in this region of the galaxy had finished forming. The Vreth fleet halted. For one long, terrible moment, nothing moved. Then Grand Arbiter Ven gave the order, and 1,000 ships opened fire simultaneously. The first volley hit Veiltharion like a wave of compressed annihilation, singularity bombs that twisted space itself into knots, particle beams that could cut through a planet's crust, gravitational weapons that tried to tear his body apart at the molecular level. He roared. The sound traveled through the vacuum on a carrier wave of pure energy, and the shock wave collapsed the shields of 14 warships in an instant, crushing them like paper lanterns in a storm. He lunged forward into the fleet, his claws raking through hull metal, as if it were wet cloth, his fire-melting weapon platforms into slag, his tail sweeping through formations and sending ships tumbling end over end into the nebula's radiation clouds. He was glorious, and he was ancient, and he was the single most powerful living thing in the known galaxy. And he was losing, because he was one, and they were 1,000, and they had come prepared. Singularity bombs detonated against his wings, tearing holes in the living metal, and he bled light, actual light, golden and white, streaming from wounds that would have killed anything else in the universe. Particle beams scored deep channels in his scales, and the pain was extraordinary, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it had been so long since anything had been able to hurt him, that he had forgotten what it felt like. Ship after ship after ship, wave after wave, and for every one he destroyed, 3 more took its place, and the weapons kept coming, and the light kept bleeding from his wounds, and his fire began to dim. He fell back. His wings cracked, great fractures spreading through the crystalline structure like fault lines through a continent. And his movements slowed, and his roar became quieter, and the golden light in his eyes flickered like a candle in a wind. Grand Arbiter Ven leaned forward in his command chair and smiled, and broadcast on an open channel that every species in the galaxy could hear. See this? Even dragons die. There is nothing beyond the reach of the Dominion. There is nothing in this galaxy that we cannot break. Vale Therion heard the broadcast. He was floating in the dark, between the burning wrecks of Vreth warships, his body broken in 100 places, his fire almost out. And he thought of Kale, the tiny warm weight of a newborn baby held in a gravitational field so gentle it could cradle a soap bubble. And he thought that Sirathine had been right, that caring was the wound that never healed, had broken the doctrine, and now he was paying the price. And then his sensors detected something at the edge of the battlefield. Ships. Not Vreth ships. Small ships. Human ships, cobbled together from salvage and scrap, patched and ugly, and held together by determination and duct tape, and the stubborn refusal to accept that something was impossible just because it looked impossible. 300 of them. And behind them, ships of 42 other species, Pelori cruisers and Keth swarm fighters and Vahari signal ships, and dozens of others, a fleet that had no right to exist, assembled by a coalition that the Vreth had declared imaginary. Kale's voice came across an open broadcast channel, clear and steady and human in a way that made Vale Tharion's cracked and bleeding heart burn bright for one impossible moment. He shielded me when the galaxy looked away. We are returning the favor. The coalition fleet hit the Vreth from behind, a swarm of hornets hitting a bear. They could not match the Dominion ship for ship, and they knew it, and they did not care. Human pilots flew suicide runs past Vreth capital ships, drawing weapons fire away from Vale Tharion's broken body, buying him seconds to breathe, to heal, to rekindle the fire that was guttering in his core. Pelori engineers hacked Vreth targeting systems using infiltration code that Kale had designed based on Drathan information theory, turning the Dominion's own weapons against their own shields for precious moments of confusion. Keth swarm fighters, tiny one-pilot craft no larger than a ground car, poured into the gaps in the Vreth formation by the thousands, each one carrying a single explosive charge, each pilot knowing that the math of their survival was essentially zero and flying forward anyway. A civilian freighter, captained by a woman named Torres, the same Torres who had confronted Kale in Haven Point's Central Hall, rammed her ship directly into the weapons array of a Vreth destroyer, crippling it, and she survived because humans build their ships stubborn just like they build themselves. The battle was chaos, beautiful, terrible, desperate chaos, and the Vreth were not losing, but they were not winning cleanly either. And for an empire built on the idea that its power was absolute and unchallengeable, not winning cleanly was the same as defeat. And then the nebula lit up behind the battlefield. Sirathine emerged from the deep clouds first, her blue-black scales swallowing the light around her, her eyes burning with a cold white fire that made the stars themselves look dim. 16 kilometers of ancient fury moving through space with a grace that should have been impossible for something her size. Behind her came 6 more Drathan elders, silver and deep red and green gold and midnight purple. Each one a living mountain, each one a force of nature that the galaxy had not seen in millennia. Motion for longer than most species had existed. The Vreth fleet detected the energy signatures, and for the first time in the battle, there was genuine silence on their communication channels. Not the silence of confidence, but the silence of animals who have just realized that the ground beneath them is not ground at all, but the back of something enormous that has just woken up. Sirathine broadcast on every frequency available, and her voice was the sound of deep space itself speaking, vast and cold and final. We told ourselves that caring was weakness. We told ourselves that the small ones were not worth the grief. We hid in our nebula and we watched civilizations burn and we called it wisdom. And then a human child taught one of us that we were wrong. And now these small, brief, impossible creatures are dying out there to protect one of our own, not because they are strong enough, but because they love him enough. And I have watched this, and I have felt something I have not felt in 10 million years, and the name of it is shame. She paused, and the pause was the held breath of a galaxy. We were not above you. We were hiding from you, and that ends now. 8 Drathan elders entered the battle. The Vreth Armada, 1,000 of the most powerful warships ever built, the pride and instrument of the greatest military empire the galaxy had ever known, was destroyed in 11 minutes. Grand Arbiter Ven's last transmission, before his ship was torn apart by Sirathine's claws, was a single sentence, spoken to no one in particular. This was not in the projections. In the silence after the battle, Vale Therian floated in the dark, broken but alive, his golden scales cracked and dim, his wings torn, his fire reduced to a low ember that pulsed with each slow breath. A small ship docked against his massive head, landing on the scarred metal landscape between his horns, and a young man climbed out, walked across the surface of a dragon's brow with steps that were steady, despite the tears running down his face. Kale pressed his hand, small and warm and human, against the ridge above Vale Therian's eye. "I told you," he said, and his voice cracked in a way that no Drathan harmonic language could replicate, because it was a human sound, imperfect and raw, and full of everything that made humans what they were. "You did not have to do it alone." Vale Therian's eye opened, the golden light dim but steady, alive, still burning after all of it. His voice was a subsonic rumble that Kale felt in his bones, and in his blood, and in the part of his heart that had belonged to this impossible creature, since the day a golden eye had opened in the dark, and chosen to care about something small. "You were always too small to protect, and too stubborn to leave unprotected." The galaxy watched the footage, in stunned and absolute silence, fractured within weeks, as subjugated species across 3 galactic arms rose up simultaneously. Not with violence, but with refusal, a quiet and immovable declaration that they would no longer cooperate with an empire that had just been proven mortal. No new empire rose to replace it. Kale and the coalition refused to claim dominion over anything, and when the Pelori ambassador asked him what he wanted to build, he answered with words that Vale Therian had taught him, and that his mother had lived and died by, without ever knowing she was teaching them to a son she would never meet. Something that endures, something that adapts, something that does not become the monster. They called it the Compact of Open Stars, a loose alliance with no capital, no supreme authority, no military hierarchy, just a shared agreement that the strong would protect the weak, and the old would teach the young, and no species would ever again face extinction alone. Not rejoin the galaxy. They were too old and too vast and too different for that. But they opened the nebulous borders for the first time in millions of years, and Sirathine herself said that any species in need of shelter could find it within their clouds. Vale Therian remained Kale's guardian, and his advisor and his family, for the rest of Kale's natural life. Decades later, when Kale's hair had gone gray, and his step had slowed, and his face carried the lines a life lived at full intensity from the first breath to what he knew would eventually be the last, he sat on the surface of Vale Therian's back, in a small habitat that had been built into the dragon's scales, like a house built into the side of a mountain. His grandchildren sat around him, 3 of them, small and bright-eyed, and full of the restless energy that was humanity's greatest gift and most enduring characteristic. They asked Vale Therian if the stories were true. All of them. Every impossible. The dragon's eye, still golden, still burning, old beyond all measuring, opened and focused on the 3 small faces looking up at him with the same fearless curiosity that their grandfather had shown on the day he was born. "Every word," Vale Therian said, and his voice was warm in a way that would have shocked any Drathan who had known him before a tiny pod had tumbled into his nebula and changed him forever. Your grandfather was the most terrifying creature I ever encountered. He was small and fragile and utterly convinced that kindness was stronger than fire. And the worst part, he paused, and the golden light in his eye brightened until the children could feel its warmth on their faces like sunlight.